Middle school's short. It's dead.
Fair enough.
God damn it.
And that's where we're going to start the podcast, so...
This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal cast with your hosts, Woad, Thirsty, and Reptile. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
Welcome to part 2 of alternative formats, and where are they? Last week we talked about Oathbreaker and cEDH, or EDH variants that have stuck around. This week, it's Premodern and Middle School.
Look, it's dead, okay? I like the format more. Mog Fanatic was great when damage used the stack. It could have been a financial driver. It kind of was, in a way. Similar to Premodern, we saw Starfoils take off, which, if you watch the podcast for any length of time, both of us were screaming into the sky. Starfoils are the next thing to take off. Invest in Starfoils. Sure enough, they did. Mm-hmm. Now we've got commons from 7th that don't see play that are worth $30 in foil. Sure.
I mean, look,
awesome.
But
they saw play in Premodern and Middle School.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The ones that see play, but like the dumb ones, I was gonna say Stormcrow and Wild Growth. Those aren't dumb. Those have a purpose.
Yeah.
Healing Salve. Like, that's just...
Yeah. Whatever. That card's not real.
Neither is 7th edition population, so they're
yeah,
problem in and of itself.
That's fair, yeah.
Like, we can dig in for people that play Middle School and Premodern. Like, a 7th edition population is probably something up their alley. But
yeah, that's true.
Like, I don't know. I love the idea of these formats. I still do. We've talked about them at length because it represents, like, to me, one of my favorite eras in Magic, which was the extended time. The time it extended once Onslaught was put into print, meaning they rotated out the dual lands, which were evergreen through the entirety of Extended. And I think that was the only rotation. And that format basically built until, I want to say, somewhere around Kamigawa, at which point the big rotation happened, and that kicked out like 4th through Invasion, and then Extended in paper matched the card population on Moto. Moto didn't have prior to Invasion yet. By the time this we were in this era, and like we jammed at Vegas. Like, maybe I'll bring something with me. But like,
you should. That'd be great.
You know, I was kind of worried when we got these announcements. Like, people were like, we're gonna try this new thing. It's Premodern. It's Middle School, and there was like just that friction of like, which one do we choose? And different entities with clout backed different things, and that was the most frustrating thing in the world for me, because they used different fucking rule sets.
Yep, and different fucking legalities. I hate it.
So MTG Goldfish and Eternal Central glom on to Middle School, which is the rule set and everything else I enjoy. I think the ban list is better.
Same. Yeah.
Everybody else, I think including Channel Fireball, gloms on to Premodern, which has same set legality but a different rule set. And at its core, I think that really separates the two. And because they never really gelled, this format just neither format really got to take off. And I think it's important because people still cling to them like they do old school. It's still a finance driver, and it's still relevant to understand.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you still see content created for both of them.
Yep.
Although Premodern at obviously a larger pace because you have the personalities backing it that you do. And the thing is, you see a little bit of an uptick in prices based on this content. It's obviously not as prevalent as the EDH content that you see.
Oh, yeah.
But there's also not as many people playing it as there are EDH. It's been interesting because over the last few months, at least locally, I've started to see tournaments take off for these formats. And that's the real interesting thing, is that you're finally seeing, at least here, a grassroots movement for these formats to be supported in an LGS. And there's only 2 LGSs here that are doing it. I know of one in Baltimore that's doing Premodern. And it's been interesting that through all of this over the last year and a half, these formats, unlike Oathbreaker, maintained momentum. And I think that's because, the community was the driver rather than the organization.
Yes.
And I think you're seeing that the community will figure out a way. Obviously, those guys were doing something much more important than managing a format. Sorry if that offends anyone, but it's the truth. So the format kind of took a back seat in the case of Oathbreaker, whereas in Premodern and Middle School, you really did see these people start to come together and say, look, we're going to make this a thing.
Yep.
We love this format. We love playing on webcams. We love playing with our friends over Skype. Great. Awesome. We love Cockatrice because Cockatrice supports these formats. Cool. Moto. Whatever.
Yep.
And it's because of that grassroots that you've started to see this. And I think that's why, something I've noticed locally when I'm trading with people and they're looking at my binder, it's like, they'll be asking for stuff like, how many accumulated knowledges do you have? How many deep analysis are you sitting on? Do you have any spectral links I could get? And these are cards that are just nothing, right?
Yeah,
You've forgotten about these cards for years. They didn't exist. They're still not worth a lot of money, but they're willing to pay more for them to get them locally. And seeing that is what really convinces me that these formats can be a financial driver, because if people are starting to trade for those cards, there's a market out there.
Yeah. I don't want to say this and sound as snooty as I'm going to say, but these formats are basically the exact same as Old School, and Old School was supported by a bunch of guys who wanted to play their Black Border Power over a webcam, pinky out. And that's the same kind of group that really just wants to jam this. It's just a bygone era when things were better, and it's kind of a nostalgia trip. And we know just from the collectible markets on the whole that that's where you want to be. That's where you need to be to make money on this stuff. And it's absolutely putting financial pressure on a lot of the odds and ends. Intuition, Allurin, continued pressure on Arabian Nights City of Brass. The foils from, you mentioned up top, the star foils from this era are all insane right now. Why does Wild Mongrel or Circular Logic need a price point? Why can't it just be a bulk foil? Because people are buying them to play this format. Psychotog, Upheaval. That card's banned in EDH. Why does it need to have a price in foil?
Literally this format and cube.
Yeah. So it's really important to understand. Old School, I don't even think... So I noticed MTG Decks has a section for pre-modern deck list. Does it have Old School? I'd eat my hat. Not the one I'm wearing because I like it. I'm not seeing one. But
no, there isn't one.
So just think about that. People are reporting back on these events because you can play them in paper, you can play them on Moto, you can feel safe at an LGS. You don't have to play them in a bar like you do Old School. That is actually, I think, mandatory. I think you have to be at a bar to play Old School.
Yeah.
Or on a
all
boat.
Of the good events it's like a meeting in Ireland. If it happens at a bar.
Yeah. I think on a boat is also acceptable.
Yes. Also yes. Definitely.
And I'm still confused as to which rule set is the best, although, like I said, I do agree with the middle schooler option. And I don't know who's winning the fight. There is a Reddit for pre-modern. It's got 1,000 members, and it's days between posts. There doesn't seem to be a Discord for it. It just doesn't seem to be that active publicly. And the biggest difference between pre-modern and middle school is really the rule set that comes along with it. Eternal Central runs the middle school rules. They run is it just the Atlantic Seaboard or the entire old school rule set for North America?
Technically, it's supposed to be the entire rule set, but I believe that it's mostly just the Atlantic Seaboard because CFB has their own set of rules.
Okay. And I knew the Atlantic Seaboard also tested 4 strip mines for a hot minute. I don't know if it's still a thing. Sorry. Yeah. Eternal Central has clout, though.
Yeah, they do.
If you play or are into Vintage Magic, they're a name you should know. The deck list reports, etc. So they own the rule set. 4th through Onslaught, that's what you can play. That's what you're looking at financially. That's the same as pre-modern. Yeah. Where it gets different, though, is that Eternal Central is more about accessibility than it is adherence to the strict guidelines of what is and is not legal from the standpoint of a Magic card. As long as it is a reprint of a card that was printed in Magic, made officially by or for WotC, it is allowed. So that means international and regulars collector's edition, gold border cards, artist proofs, and then the supplementals like the John Finkel v. Richard Garfield stuff.
Yeah.
Beat down, all that other stuff.
Anthologies, everything, which is why in middle school, Hymn to Turok is legal, but it's not in Premodern. Stupid.
And the other part is that, like I believe their old school rules, it adheres to the rules of the time. So that is basically prior to the changes in M10, where mana burn is still a thing, damage goes on the stack, and the wish cycle works like they used to, which basically means when you wish for a card, it's got to come out of your sideboard, and you just literally replace them 1-to-1. If you ever look at a Psychotog, or primarily a Mirari's Wake list, there's 3 Cunning Wish in the main and 1 in the sideboard. And the entire reason for that is once you play Mirari, you cast Cunning Wish, you copy it with Mirari, you get your wish, and you replace it with another wish. So you always have 1 in your sideboard. So you can always keep going for your sideboard for another card. And eventually you'll just churn through your sideboard. And that'll be that. You'll have one wish left. And like, I think everything else is an instant. And that to me is huge for that era because, as you named up at the top, Mog Fanatic is an incredible card in that era. There are a number of decks that just actually cannot function without damage using the stack.
Mog Fantastic was what we called it.
Exactly.
It was great.
Exactly. Mog Fantastic was a 1/1 that kills an X2. It doesn't matter as long as it doesn't fly. If it can block it, it can kill it. End of story. Exalted Angel, another fantastic card that required damage using the stack. Aquamobia, another one.
Yep.
Make it a 3/1. You want to block it? Cool. Put 3 damage on the stack. Flip it back to
reverse
a 1/3.
power tough.
Yes.
Great.
Like, these cards just don't function without that. And Premodern basically wrote a fuck off. We're using contemporary rules because it allows us to play on Moto diatribe to describe what they're doing. So that means none of those alternative face cards are quote unquote legal when you're playing. Those is a fan driven thing, and we want it to be as widely accessible as possible, so we're adhering to what we can do on Moto. I'll go over my right shoulder and I'll go take my Allurans out and I'll play it on webcam. I'm not gonna go get my wallet, come back, install Moto, see if it runs, maybe wait for an update. Maybe I can pay? Does a bot have Alluran? I don't know. I'm not doing that. I want to play this format in paper. I want to enjoy it the way I used to. Pinky out.
Yep. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Not at all. But the announcement of these sets and the Eternal Central rule set was incredibly important. That pushed City of Traders, World Champ stuff. Gaia's Cradle and Force of Will were already on the up and up from EDH, but that puts additional pressure on it. You have Masticore and Fetch. Some of them, not all 5 Fetch lands were in World Championship decks. No. I can't remember, but Flooded Strand and Windswept Heath and Bloodstained Mire, I know, were in various World Champs decks.
Yeah, I think those were the 3
because that's Mirari's Wake and Goblins, respectively.
Yeah,
and then. Just a number of Grim Monolith, right? EDH pressure,
Monolith. Yep.
EDH, cEDH, and now you have a middle school coming through, and this was hugely important to those finance drivers, and these formats, they're still active, but it's a lot of below the surface.
Yeah.
So if you want to actually get on board with these formats and figure out, okay, where can I go, what can I pivot to, what can I figure out, what can I pick up, you have to start jumping into these discords. They're out there. I don't know if there are Facebook groups for them the same way old school keeps.
There are,
but those are your drivers. That's where you've got to be. I couldn't find any deck dumps. I couldn't find any actual websites forum style where people were gathering. I couldn't actually, in the bit of searching that I did, find a single Discord link, but I know they're out there because I was in one for a while.
And I think this is one where it's important because with pre-modern and middle school, they're a lot more grassroots, just like old school was. And old school very quickly became a financial driver.
Yep.
Pre-modern and middle school kind of started to have a presence, and then all of a sudden, oh, we're pandemic, so let's hold these events. And now you're starting to see that support rise again. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those things where when we say as you're starting out, pay attention to your local metagame. That's where 90%, at this point, 99% of your clientele is. Pay attention to that because that's the stuff you're going to need. And with these formats especially, paying attention to your local metagame is so much more important because getting asked about that spectral links, all of a sudden, you know what, the trade's even. You mind if I take this spectral links too? Great. It may only be 25 cents on TCG Player. Somebody will probably trade you $2 for that. You get them enough spectral links, maybe you get a fetch land out of it. Who knows?
Yeah.
That's what you're looking at. And it's so much more important with these especially to pay attention to that grassroots movement, to pay attention to that local metagame where these people are like, you know what, I'm going once a week to the LGS, or I'm just playing with my friends at our kitchen table. That's all we're doing, but we're playing every week, and we need these cards for these decks. Yeah. And it's also something that, as an LGS, you kind of have an opportunity because these cards are so affordable. You could even say, hey, we want to start getting this going. Does anyone want to, come out and play and we'll have free decks for people? Sure. Why not? I just think that's a great opportunity for an LGS, being able to lend those out and create and cultivate that community.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I think we are just a step away from is what happened with old school, which is innovation within the space. So the first thing that happened with old school was people just went back to what they knew. And they built the decks that they remember, what deck lists they could find, and they began playing the game. The difference between literal old school, like 93, 94, and now is that deck building was wildly different, not because the cards now are better or worse, but because ideology was wildly different. So once they went back and started applying current ideology about things like card advantage to the format, innovation began, and we started seeing this interesting cyclical nature in the format, and things like Jizam Jam eventually picked up because mono black aggro was something to do compared to what was going on previously. Then once that picks up, innovate. You start building against it. We are not quite there just yet with either of these formats. People went back to what they were playing, and it's not like the ideology for this era of Magic is where it is now, but it's much closer. So people just went straight back to what we were doing. They have their 75 plus a box of extra for what's going on. Ask me about my astral slide stuff, and they are going to get to that point, and that's where you want to be for finance stuff. And it's going to take a little bit to get into from a monetary standpoint because you're going to start wanting to buy some larger ticket items. It doesn't need to be the reserve list stuff that operates in this space. I call that Intuition and Allurin up top. There's also Mastercore and a number of other cards from Urza Saga that play really well in these formats. But it is going to most likely be foils of some sort.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's worth, one of the other things that I think you need to keep an eye on with this stuff is we haven't really innovated because we're going to the decks that worked back then, right? Well, the counterpoints to those decks aren't necessarily things that have been explored yet.
Yeah.
Just because, I'll harken back to Combo Winner in Legacy, right? When we had Solidarity all over the place. You had Solidarity, Threshold when Werebear was your best threat, and then Goblins. And those were your decks. Well, there were counters to those decks, and those haven't been explored yet necessarily in pre-modern and middle school. Mm-hmm. So based on your metagame, hey, you know what? Maybe this is an opportunity for me to pick up cards that play well against Slide because a bunch of people are playing Slide right now. How can I get them? Cool. Awesome. Let's do that.
And to lean on that, 4th through Onslaught is a huge chunk of Magic and chunks of Magic that didn't exist at the same time.
Yep.
A deck like Fruity Pebbles, a combo deck like Fruity Pebbles, and a combo deck like Tricks did not exist alongside an aggressive deck like Goblins, or a tempo control deck like Astral Slide, or a control deck like Wake. And it really is just still within an era of Magic, just wildly different ends of the spectrum coming together and clashing, and people just haven't really begun kind of mixing and matching and figuring out what goes best and where you want to countercomp, to your point. And a lot of that is because there just hasn't been a lot of opportunity to do so, with these communities being so subsumed. But as people are able to return to them either locally or find them more as they continue to be written about, which is the great thing, because I think somebody was just pushing one of these formats the other day. I know the profs put out videos and things like that. That's where we'll see these drivers. And it doesn't take that much to get into this format, and it's not like you have to go off buying chaff either.
No.
If you wanted to move in on foils, like I mentioned, there are F&M foils from this era.
There are.
And some of them that even overlap. We're never going to play Historic in paper. But you know what? Memory Elapse might actually be a card that we see at some point in time reprinted. That has an F&M foil. Psychotalk, that the price graph for that went straight up. And I believe it's come back down, but that's, another card you can look at. You can basically begin scanning these. You don't need to start looking for, like, prismatic strands and other odds and, like, voice of all, stuff like this to countercomp. You can look in and see what people are doing and say, like, okay, what are people playing? What existed in that era? Because all that information's still there. It's not that old. The deck dumps are still there, either hosted by WotC or third-party sites. And start looking and saying, okay, if we're here, and, like, you look at MTG decks, right? And I know, again, Premodern is not Middle School, but you're like, okay, if Landstill and Goblins are one of the most played decks, and underneath that is Rock, like, what from that era played well against them? And you're like, okay, against Landstill, you either need to play a longer game or you need to get under them early. So it's probably pretty decent, like Dead Guy L. So let's look at that. Let's just destroy their hand, destroy their permanents, and leave them with a standstill on the board. Cool.
Yeah.
Start looking at that. Or I'm going to be even more of an ass. Stasis. It's hard to play standstill when you're locked under a stasis, you nerd.
Yeah.
And you can start looking at that and seeing, like, what plays well and picking relevant cards for when people begin innovating and just staying up to date with things, because even with old school, people love brewing in public.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think a lot of this, especially with formats like this, to me, I think about these formats and I brew a lot more when I kind of immerse myself in them. And it's not that hard for me to do because I'm so used to, like, I played them.
Yep.
And I think this is one of those opportunities where your knowledge as a player and based on your history, you may be able to profit more readily than someone who didn't necessarily play there. Not to, like, toot an old head horn or anything, but that opportunity exists.
Yeah.
And I think that's when mentioning the deck dumps and everything is really important, because there is an opportunity for a newer player as well, because like you said, old school innovated because deck building strategies changed over time. The Rock was the Rock.
Yep.
But if you look at certain lists, there's multiple iterations of the Rock on MTG decks. There's, the Abzan list, or Junk as we called it back then, which it will always be to me. The ran Gerard's Verdict and Spectral Links, because it was there to counter some of the, like, mono white shenanigans and your, like, standstill stuff. Well, I've got stuff that can block all day. I'll disrupt your hand while destroying your permanents, kind of like a Dead Guy Ale.
Yep. And
you start to see that innovation play into it, and that's one of the things that, as you mentioned, is another opportunity for growth with those.
Yep. And out of all the three formats, I wish Oathbreaker would do the most in the next coming year, because I think that is the most innovative space to be, but these formats will probably always hold my heart.
I agree with that. Very much so. Like this Middle School and Premodern, especially, because like you said, those were when I grew up playing. Those were the glory days, right? Yeah. That was when I had this burning passion and I loved Magic and I loved Magic players. And then I got jaded and old and started hating everything about it because it was my full-time job. But I digress. You have that nostalgia for it because that's when you started, and this great, amazing game was, like, new to you and you were having fun with it. And it wasn't necessarily only about winning. It was about winning, but also You wanted to enjoy what you were doing. And it's like going back to the simpler era of Magic where Shivan Dragon was one of the most efficient threats ever printed. You didn't have Dark Confidant then. You were drawing a card, and if you had a Howling Mine, maybe you drew an extra one.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel fine about certain standard sets or formats after this era, but nothing as fondly as really extended. And I think if you talk to people that played in this era, they won't even point to, you're like, all right, what was your favorite format, standard or extended in this era? And they'll probably say extended because it was super vibrant. It was just,
it really was,
like, probably one of the most vibrant formats I've ever seen, short of like Legacy after Survival Ban.
Yeah,
where people were just like, well, we don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah, this format was survival for months. What are we gonna do?
Yeah.
All right, let's figure it out.
Folk did well one time.
Yeah.
Try that.
And one of the reasons, and this is an example of this time being so vibrant, I remember playing Extended, and I was playing an opponent who was on Mind's Desire, and I was on Zubera Altar.
Yep.
Which, for those of you that are listening, is Phyrexian Altar plus all the Zubera spirits from Kamigawa. That was a deck, and it was good. That's how vibrant this Extended was. Those words should never be said in a sentence. But that's where we were. And my opponent is sitting there playing Mind's Desire, and he storms off. And he asks, can I shortcut? And I say, sorry, would you mind just going through the motions? Okay, fine. He's on Mind's Desire at 6. I time stop him. After he goes through all the motions. Sure, I was an asshole, but that was the kind of stuff you could do then. Because it was such an open, vibrant format where there was stuff that has never happened anywhere else, even in Legacy, even in Vintage, even in Pauper, in the history of Magic, because that was, to me, the most wide open metagame we have ever had in Magic, was that era Extended.
Yep. And I think that was the last time we truly saw a real week-to-week format. And what I mean by that isn't like, oh, this deck won, so we will innovate the other deck in Standard to beat it. It's like, no, Goblins won. The top 8 was just like, whatever, we need to beat Goblins. Okay, now Dump Truck wins, so what do we do? I don't know. We'll play Tinker. Okay, Tinker won, so what do we do? Ban it, and then we'll play Allurin. And that's what happened. It really was a week-to-week or event-to-event format. And, specialists aside, it was wicked fun, and I expect a lot of this to kind of pick up, not because of rose-colored glasses, but because I do think a lot of people will begin to understand what this format within Magic is about, and that's where, to cap back at what we're talking about this episode, the financial drivers will come from. We'll see an uptick in the World's Champs cards, which are just easy pickings. Like those decks, I think some of them are still sealed, pretty easy to attain. Not the Kaibude ones, because he plays things like Grim Monolith, but things like the Daniel Zink Wake deck. And I think there's the Daniel and Neatnajin green-white slide list.
Yep.
There's a Goblin binning list, I think.
There is.
You just kind of go through this and you see what can you pick up, and that's kind of where I would lean on and what I would look into. And a lot of that is in, like I said, preparation. Some of it is looking at lists and seeing what's there, and the rest of it is going to be based on embedding myself again in the community and just listening to what's going on and engaging. And I think Oathbreaker, I believe, is going to be the format that does the most. I want it to do the most, but I think that Middle School and Premodern is where I would probably be able to make the most money. I might have to spend the most money to make the most money, but I think this is going to be the format where I'll be able to make the most.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's important that you touch on spending the most to make the most, as realistically, I think part of that as well. So if you do decide to go into those, that is something to be mindful of, that look, you're probably going to be spending a little bit more. Hey, sorry, man. That's how it is.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, you don't have to buy the reserve list stuff. Not at all. But it's just, not everybody wants Spectral Links. Not everybody wants Phyrexian Plague Lords. People are going to want some of the more expensive stuff. Patriarch Bidding, finally cheap. Love the Goblins list, overall cheap. But TOG is not. So it's like a give and take. You got to figure out where you want to put your money. And I don't really have an idea or a suggestion of how to do that.
Hey, this works.
Just
do it.
Exactly. Yeah. Picks?
Let's do it.
All right. I want to go first. Because I said
go
so.
for it.
All right. So I'm going back to Theros. We were there 2 weeks ago. Then we went to Modern Horizons. Now we're going back to Theros. So this week for me is another God weapon, but it is the green one this time. We are going with
Nylea's Bow
of Nylea. Yep. So Bow of Nylea, great card. One of my favorite weapons from the set. Disregard this incredible spike right after call time. We'll talk about it in a moment, but that's why I picked it, is because we spiked, we're coming back down, and now we're starting to settle. And the important part is not only did that happen, but buy lists has started to pick up. So we're looking at about $3.80 market, which is pretty decent. Overall, the card is great. The first line is pretty much the most important part of this. Attacking creatures you control have Death Touch. Awesome. That's really what we're looking at here. Then the activated ability is pretty heady, but it does some really good things. Choose one. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, or above Nylea deals 2 damage to target creature with flying, or you gain 3 life, or put up to 4 target cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Right? It's basically like Primal Command, and all your creatures have Death Touch.
Pretty great.
So initially, when I put this on my list, it was back in June, after a Ikoria release. And I did it with these numbers. TCG market, $4.57, 192 copies. CK buy price, $0. 0 copies. Okay? That's how much faith I had on this card. I've been sitting on it for 6 months with CK buying none. CK is now buying 90 for $1.60, and they're buying a handful of set foils for $5 each. So buy list finally picked up. Mystery Booster was on CK's buy list when I looked at this originally, and that was the only one that stood there for a while. Now they actually upped buy quantity. They're looking for 93, up from 90. So overall, this plays primarily in decks that want to enter combat and end the game that way. As we'll talk about later, it could be one of a few ways to end the game, but attack you is the shared strategy across all of this stuff. And Bow of Nylea provides an interesting keyword for a lot of decks that want to enter combat to win the game, so this is what's relevant to the format on the whole. It could be that you're entering combat with a horde of creatures and just want to clear the way with Death Touch, or your deck goes big with Trample, and this is how you, quote, go home, go big or go home. You could even be looking to play something like Finn the Fangbearer and or Saerith the Viper's Fang and want to poison someone out. But the common threat continues to remain: go to combat, attack. By itself, Bow puts in some work making combat awkward for the defender, because that's what math is for, but combined with something like Nylea, God of the Hunt, or another effect that grants trample to the squad, spell or permanent based, could be an overrun, it could end games incredibly quickly, because you only need to deal the 1 damage to the creature before you trample over for the rest. And this card, if we look back at the stocks graph, it just lurked for a really long time below the surface compared to the other weapons that aren't Spear of Heliod, because there was minimal intrigue and, again, a rather linear strategy. But as of late, with recent sets, we've seen a number of new commanders, like Toski, make Bow more appealing to a wider crowd. So look at this, like from Theros release all the way up to call time, it just sits at about 2 and change, and then it nigh doubles. That's where the floor is right now. So I don't want to downplay the demand for werewolves either, which is a fairly recent tribe and limited in win cons, ways to win the game in combat while keeping your creatures around. Like, Bow does a lot here. And the activated ability, like Bident, which is what I picked 2 weeks ago, is another interesting point to this card. There's 4 modes. I really consider them 3, because 3 life is like hooty hoo. All 3 modes can be relevant, though 2 remain relevant through the entirety of the game, and that is the counter and recycling cards. So the activated ability is good, but more food for thought than anything else. It's not like Bident, where it's just like, make combat really weird for you by making you attack. Now, this nigh vertical spike at call time release is basically because of Finn the Fangbearer with a bit of Toski on the side. So Finn the Fangbearer is an uncommon from call time. It's a 1/3 for 2. It's a legend with Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 poison counters. It doesn't matter how much damage you deal. It's always 2, and that's very specific to remember, but that card basically causes that, like, that huge spike. Like I said, Toski is also really good with this as well, because when you play Toski, generally speaking, you're going to Voltron Toski, so you need a way to give it Death Touch and then trample over for the rest to draw your card and actually enact your game plan, which is, I play green, I have 40 cards in hand. So, now, that spike at call time, pretty much a false flag for both the floor and the ceiling of this card, and since then, we've really just been seeing it tumble down until, I think, the last couple of days where it finally plateaued. So I'm expecting a bit more of a retrace over time, but within 6 to 9 months, we should be seeing true growth, and in close to a year is when I would expect to get out of these 2 buy list. As always, this can change if it pops off in Commander content, or we continue to receive more cards like Finn and Saerith. Now, Saerith isn't that great. It's a card I mentioned twice. It's from Midnight Hunt, and it's just a mono green commander, 2 and 2 green for a 3/4. Other tap creatures you control have Death Touch. Excuse me. Untap creatures you control have Hexproof, and then an activated ability to untap another target creature. So it basically just works really well with Finn the Fangbearer. These 3 cards just work well together, and the attack you theme thus overall. So again, that last point, if it pops off, or we get more commanders that fit into like that kind of theme where it gives you an alt win con, then I expect it to pop off. Reprint equity note, same as Biden. We just went back to Theros. We got the original gods. We didn't get any of their weapons. I don't foresee this or any weapon really getting a raw EDH treatment, but we don't know what's coming in the Warhammer set.
Yeah.
And that is a location we could see this. Bident, I mentioned new Double Masters because her Bident too. I don't think that's the case here. And I don't, because these are locked into the names of the gods, that's why I don't think we would get them in just a raw EDH treatment. But because the I forgot what the hell they're called now. The additional IPs, when they're going to just slam stuff into the Warhammer universe next, right? And we get so-and-so's Bow of Malarkey underneath it.
Yeah.
Bow of Nylea. Like, that's where I could see it happening. But not just, here's your green-red commander deck that also has Bow of Nylea in it. Like,
yeah.
That I don't see.
No, I'd say reprint equity is pretty low on this one for that reason. Just facts. I've loved this card for a long time. I think it's the best of the weapons for EDH, especially. Bident is good, but it's in a color that already has plenty of things that do that. So it's not necessarily unique. And Bow is just a good value card that appeals to casual players as well as competitive. I love that card. I think it's great.
Yeah, it was interesting to see CK all of a sudden start buying them, and that was kind of the trigger, was just like, once CK was buying them, and not even at a small quantity, that's when it's just time to fire on this and start paying attention, so.
Yeah, for sure. My pick is a little bit more nebulous, so I am going for the set version of Mirran Crusader. Why, you ask? Well, it's not because Phyrexian Crusader is seeing a bunch of spikes in prices and it's sure to follow. It's not it at all, I promise. It's because of the way the modern meta has shifted. So we're seeing more and more red-based decks and black-based decks because of Ragavan. This card's obviously too slow for Ragavan. I'm hedging my bets and praying that Wizards does the right thing and bans Ragavan in Modern. I think they should probably just ban Lurrus, but whatever. I think they're going to ban Ragavan. Once WotC is done shipping out MH2 and they can finally say, look, our flagship card from this set doesn't matter. We got our money. We're moving on, kind of like they did with Hogak. I think when that meta happens, when we see Ragaband, we're going to see that the meta sticks to kind of a red-black aggro. We'll still have Death Shadow. We'll still have red-black aggro because Kroxa and Darcy are still cards that exist. And I think you'll start to see a rise in the Vile decks in the format. And one of the reasons I say this is because in the sourced top 32 we have for Vegas, there were a number of Vile decks in spots 16 through 32. Just too slow for Ragavan.
Yep.
Those decks become much, much better in a Ragavan-less format. And I think that is where they start to shine, really. And once that happens, Mirran Crusader becomes one of the better sideboard pieces for those decks. I think you're looking at, 32 cents or whatever it is now. You're probably never going to get back up to the $10 to $15 that it used to be. But I could very realistically see a world in the next 6 months where all of a sudden we're sitting at a $5 price tag on TCG Player because this card is so relevant to sideboards in the format, and potentially even mainboardable. Obviously, as with most of my picks lately, the catalyst for this is going to be paper events. When we start having large-scale paper events again, especially in Modern, because that's the most popular format, that's when you'll start to see this take off. I would figure around 6 months. I think, again, we're going to see WotC say, look, channel, Star City, you want to run your tournaments, you can be the guinea pigs, you can take that liability, we'll see what happens. And I think that once we get an announcement that says OP is coming, hopefully, again, 6 to 9 months, that's when you start to see this happen.
Okay.
If we get it sooner, great. But I'd be saying at around 6 months is when you're able to profitably buy list this, if you pick it up now. And not just arbitraging to credit at CK, but profitably buy list this card. So I just think it's a good meta call. Maybe I'm wrong. I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again. It was just a call out. I noticed that Vial decks are getting, if they're in that range, that means they're 2 week to Ragavan, which was all over the top 16. They start remove Ragavan from the tournament. All of a sudden, look, Darcy's a good clock, but it's not as good as Ragavan. Yeah. Vial decks can sort of move up in the meta.
I don't even know if this applies necessarily to Vial decks. Like, Mirran Crusader can just exist in the sideboard of decks that want to play like a tempo game.
Yeah.
Like, usually, those kind of decks are also going to play Stoneforge Mystic and Equipment, so you just have a bit of a similar package anyway. But you're not worried about saving yourself the mana with a Vial, because you're able to tempo out the game and find a spot to cast Crusader where you won't die and you can take over with Crusader. Like, I've seen Taxes lists recently, Humans lists, which this also is, but doesn't play well in that deck. And I do agree that there's opportunity for one or both of those decks to pick up in this card to kind of, I don't want to say tag along, but definitely come along for the ride. You mentioned Croxa and Darcy, but another common pairing for that is Death Shadow.
Yeah.
Which Grixis Death Shadow is rising just in Modern in general. And also inside that deck is Ragavan. But that deck does not need Ragavan. It didn't have it before, and it won't need it in the future if it is banned. But this stonewalls, aside from Darcy, Dragon Grace Channeler, every other threat in the deck as it stands. And I think this is just a really good card to have in general. Like, you should be having this. There's a world in which I see WotC taking Umezawa's Jite off of the ban list.
Oh God, I hope not. Oh my God. That would be so bad for the format, but who knows, they've done worse.
Why? Look, Smelt is a card, it costs 1 red. Kill your Jite. Look, it's a 2-mana Planeswalker. Tybalt's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should unban Deathrite, but what do I know?
Look, that's a 1-mana Planeswalker. You can't have that. They don't know how to balance it yet. They figured it out with Tybalt. Easy.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah. Well, what happens? Merfolk gets better? Is that what you're worried about?
No, it just kills every aggro deck in the format. I mean, it's better than Ragavan, let's be real.
Yeah, I mean, with Ragavan gone, what is that?
Send my Stoneforges to the moon, please.
Yeah, but there's a world in which that happens. And in that instance, Mirran Crusader does a really good job carrying a Jite.
It does.
Sultai Infect, I watched get beat up all day long this week on Star City Versus. They just lost the gauntlet. But that's not to say that, Simic Infect doesn't come back. And you know what? Yeah. This blocked green creatures all day long. It's really good against that too. It doesn't need equipment to do that. It just stonewalls. You might be dead by 3, but that's a different problem.
Yeah, you can figure that out yourself.
I think this is just, from a speculative standpoint, a good card to pick up on because its stock is currently low, and this has had a foothold in Modern before. And from a playability standpoint, if you don't have them, you should for that same reason. It is good, and when you need it, and you don't want to not have it. And I think this is just a good look overall for both of those reasons. And if you were ever thinking about playing Legacy, Death and Taxes is fairly approachable at this point, and this is cornerstone is a wrong word, but it is almost always in the 75 somewhere. So you're going to be picking them up anyway.
Yep.
Might as well get them now. But I think that's going to be it for this week, unless there's anything else you got.
I'm good.
All right. So for at MtG Cabalcast, which you can find on Twitter, Patreon, Facebook, and YouTube. The audio podcast is on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, I think Audible. Not sure. They're jerks. Probably everywhere else, though. I am at Halt. I am Reptar. You are...
At Thirsty Sizzler.
This is a much better sign-off than last week.